Hi everyone, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, October 5th, where we are putting some closure onto Dracula and talking about our next film from the 1940s, Cat People. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about writing papers and the final project as well. So, in terms of Dracula, where we had left off, as I had asked you in the discussion forum response, to see whether or not you agreed or disagree with the Library of Congress's designation and their film registry that Dracula is culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. And it was pretty much universal that yes, all of you agreed that that's the case, if for no other reason because Dracula has become so iconic. As you know, Dracula is considered to be the first American horror film. Dr. Caligari, or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, considered the first horror film from the 1920s, but that would be a German film. This, Dracula, from the 1930s, would be an American film. And outside of the fact that Dracula is so iconic, I really wanted to focus on some of the literary elements associated with the film, particularly symbolism. And I had mentioned this a little bit in my previous video, but you can see in the notes below that I've reiterated that there's lots of different ways to view Dracula. Obviously, the 1930s was a time of great economic turmoil, so film industry provided escapism, and it wouldn't have been lost on an audience that Dracula could be seen as a kind of blood-sucking capitalist, who basically is living off of the lifeblood of others. And certainly that's the way many film viewers would probably feel themselves in the midst of the Great Depression. Dracula obviously coming from great privilege, very aristocratic, but of course, because Dracula comes from the other, and that would be Transylvania in our particular instance, he is such a wonderful symbol and such a wonderful metaphor for the idea of foreigner coming and usurping American ideals and basically implanting his own ideals into American society by creating basically other versions of himself, which is what the vampire does basically. It just creates additional life forms. And it's no surprise that most of Dracula's victims, being female, would lead to particular anxieties about the idea of contaminating bloodlines. Though, as some of you pointed out, there is that scene with Renfield that could be read from a homoerotic perspective. That said, understand that the novel Dracula is quite different than the film. And I talked a little bit about some of the liberties that the film took, including collapsing some characters. So the Renfield character in the novel would not be the real estate agent who initially goes to Dracula's castle. That would be actually Jonathan Harker. But for the purposes of film, and as I think at least one of you noted, that the ending is so hurried, almost criminally so, I would say, if you've ever read the novel, there's much more story to be told, and it almost seems as if the filmmakers decided that once they had hit their time mark, that they had to put a quick resolution to the story. But outside of perhaps those negatives, I think there are more positives than negatives that would earn Dracula the distinction of being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Not just from the symbolic ideas of sexuality. And in fact, when we get to Cat People, we're going to talk about a highly erotic film. But the sense of penetration and the vampire penetrating female is, of course, a possible sexual metaphor. Even the stake itself, as I had indicated in some of your journal responses, could be seen as quite phallic. And we already know that the Gothic oftentimes presents corruption of female, and this is something that we will definitely see when we move to Cat People. The past invading the present, and this is a common Gothic motif, and certainly Dracula representing the historical past and taking over and if you read the novel, it would make a lot more sense that Dracula and Transylvania is very much presented as a kind of backward area that is trying to invade a more modern Europe. Again, sort of illustrating some of the fears of things like foreigners and things like whether or not bloodlines could be contaminated. And I think that that's also a contemporary fear when we think about some of the anxieties associated with immigration. Van Helsing, I always thought was a fascinating character because of his ability to embrace both science but spirituality as well. Obviously, there's a huge Christian message that's embedded within this particular text. We'll see this as well with Cat People, but it's obviously much more embedded in something like Dracula, where Christianity is indeed savior. And if we wanted to talk about Dracula as other, not only is it about foreigner, but it could also be related to anti-Semitism. As I had pointed out last class, that I wanted you to pay particular attention to Dracula's medallion, which has oftentimes been likened to the Star of David, and that one of the ways that Dracula could be seen as other is through religious difference, and perhaps a standism or stand-in actually for some of the anti-Semitism of the time period. But the cinematography, considering the time period, remember that the National Historic Registry wanted something that was culturally important and certainly has become iconic, historically important, and certainly as the first horror film, it's historically important and aesthetically significant, and the majestic sets. And again, while the cinematography might seem pretty archaic to us now, it wouldn't have appeared that way to a 1930s audience. And even the costumes, even in today's, I think, a conception of costumes, are quite breathtaking. I mentioned to several of you to note the costume changes that occur with Mina as she becomes increasingly corrupted by Dracula. And the sense of the animalistic overtaking her, in part, is suggested through more revealing attire, that she becomes much more sexual and much more erotic. So I certainly agree that Dracula has earned its place as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Now, Cat People, which came out in the 1940s, is not as well known as Dracula, but I would argue that in some ways it's equally important. It has the distinction of giving us our first jump scare in horror film, or what it's thought of as the first jump scare in horror film. So I suppose that in and of itself makes it important. But a film to be able to tackle the idea of female sexuality, I don't want to give away too many spoilers about Cat People at this point. My suspicion is that most, if not all of you, have not seen the film. You may not have even heard of the film. But there's definitely a psychological bent to this film. Definitely it talks about inner evil, and it's very moody. It's very atmospheric. So from a cinematic perspective, it's quite beautiful. There's lots of fog, there's lots of shadow, so it very much has that gothic feel to it. The first jump scare, if you want to be surprised, then don't read the notes below this video until you've actually watched the movie, because I identify what the first jump scare is, but I don't necessarily want to tell you where that occurs in the film in case you want to be surprised. One of the more famous scenes in the film happens in a swimming pool. It was something that actually Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue had talked a little bit about as well. And what we've got are a series of characters who I think work wonderfully as symbols. We've got our main female lead. Her name is Irina, and she's Serbian, and she's supposed to represent foreigner in the old world. And then we've got our male lead, and his name is Oliver, and he's an American. He's supposed to represent the new world. At one point, he even calls himself a good old Americano. Expect not only a very psychological movie. Keep in mind that ultimately some of the theories of Freud were becoming part of the public consciousness. but I expect a level of subtlety and ambiguity that we perhaps haven't seen up until this point. So I think what you can see in watching Cat People is the progression as well of more sophisticated storytelling and more sophisticated cinematography, which we will see as the semester progresses. One of the ways to view this film is thinking about not just the anxieties associated with sexuality, but the anxieties associated with intimacy. And keep that in mind as you're watching, as well as all of the possible symbols that are associated with cats. And certainly there's lots of superstitious symbolism associated with cats, a superstitious evil, black cats in particular. In Egypt, they were seen as gods, and what you will see is a lot of cat imagery in this particular film. In fact, you'll also hear audio, and now we've got a film that's got not just dialogue, but it's also got soundtrack as well. And that said, expect some unexpected Christian symbolism as the movie progresses, especially within some of the shadow and shadow play. In terms of Cat People, I think that one of the more interesting things about the film is that it's, from a thematic perspective, very literary. I mean, the themes of dark versus light, or good versus evil, or sexuality versus chastity, make it, I think, very much read like a piece of literature. And I wanted to transition over to talking a little bit about how we have been reading these films from more than just an entertainment perspective, but from an analytic perspective as well. And not just viewing them as cultural reflections of their time and place, but also as just independent stories that could be analyzed in terms of things like characterization or themes or symbols. And all of those could be possibilities for your final project. So this is my segue into the final project. And you'll notice, if you want to go to the notes below under the second section, it's entitled Writing Papers and Final Project. And in that particular section, you'll see that there is a handout that I posted in the Syllabus and Other Documents folder that talks about the final project. And I just wanted to read that to you because I'm hopeful that at this point you're beginning to think about the final project now that we've already seen several films. And this is going to be due either on or before the last day of class. Obviously, the sooner the better that you can submit it for everybody involved. But you've got up until the ending of the semester, so if it turns out that you wanted to work with one of the later pieces, one of the later films that we're addressing over the semester, certainly you can wait. But I encourage you to begin thinking now. And the course project is an analysis of the role of horror film in media and popular culture. And the analysis will likely, at least from my past experience, take the role of a written paper. And if you are going to write a written paper, I'd say approximately 4 to 5 pages. But approximately is just that, approximately, as long as it needs to be in order for you to be able to make a good argument. But this does not preclude oral and or visual submissions. So that said, if you're going to be doing something creative, I especially urge you to begin sooner rather than later. So I've had students do all kinds of things. I've had students actually create their own short horror films. This requires a lot of time and a lot of planning. I've had students who have presented to the class via PowerPoint or through video. In this instance, since we're an online class, you wouldn't be presenting live, but you could post something for us to watch if you so wanted, a presentation that you would be giving, much like I post these class videos. That would be another option for you. I've had students who've actually created horror video games and talked a little bit about the genre of video game and its connection to horror film. I've had students even create models, and I think I might have shared with you that there are a couple of models, one of Dr. Caligari, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and the other of Psycho, in the GCC library that were created by one of my former students. And usually when you're doing these more creative projects, you include some written text explaining what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you're doing it. But again, it depends on the project. So in terms of thinking about what you could discuss, and I've just generated some very general topics here. Symbolism, which like I was talking about earlier with Dracula, or even with Cat People, to focus on one particular film and analyze its symbolism. Certainly we did this with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as well, when we were talking about German authoritarian government. Or this is a class in medium popular culture. So discuss how and why horror films are popular in our culture. So that would be perhaps a different perspective. Or you can view this from a historical perspective. It's the way that basically I've organized the chronology of the class so that you can see historical progression. Examine the historical progression of horror film in our culture. And what does that say about our culture? Or, as we established at the beginning of the semester, is that horror film usually examines fears and anxieties, not just of individuals, but of larger groups of cultures as well. So examine how and why horror films express social and cultural fears, anxieties. Obviously, these are very broad topics. So if you decided to pursue any of them, you would really have to refine them to get down a specific thesis. But this is the point of the semester where you want to begin contemplating some possibilities. And as I said, you can choose any of the topics that I've indicated or create your own. The following are only suggestions, so feel free to adapt, combine, or even dismiss. If you do choose to write on your own topic, it makes sense for you to briefly discuss the topic with me. Honestly, it makes sense for all of you to briefly discuss the topic with me at one point or another, just so that I can give you some feedback and some direction. And the syllabus talks a little bit about paper formatting specifications, so that if it turns out that you are writing the traditional paper, my suspicion is that you've already had experience doing so in other classes. It's one of the reasons why English 101 is a prerequisite for this class. So you've probably talked about the conventions of writing a paper, but it should be following the MLA, or the Modern Language Association system. I hope this sounds familiar to you, that this is the system we use in the humanities, and a communication class, much like this one, would be considered part of the humanities. And the conventions, just in terms of formatting, is typed, double space, 1-inch margins. Again, that's indicated on the syllabus, with a cover page, with just a separate sheet of paper that lists the title and some contact information, your name, my name, the class, the due date. That's pretty straightforward. In terms of thinking about how to write a paper, you probably have some resources from previous English classes, but you can also note that in our second section in our notes below, I've also indicated some suggestions that really you want to think about it in the process of 3 pieces: planning, writing, and editing. And I'm encouraging you now to spend some time planning. The sooner the better. And I can tell you that certainly my experience with English papers, because I teach English classes, is that most students don't put much or even any effort into the planning, and they go directly into the writing. And they try to write the perfect first sentence, and the writing suffers as a result of that. And also time. You end up basically wasting a lot of time trying to construct the perfect first sentence, rather than spending time more efficiently by planning ideas. The beauty of it is that the planning stage is for your eyes only. So whether you want to call it brainstorming or free writing or just taking down notes, I do suggest you write it down just so that you don't begin to forget important ideas. And the way that I personally do it is in list format. So much like I put the notes beneath our videos as list format, that's basically the way that I construct papers. But regardless of how you do it, the planning phase is just that, planning for your eyes only. And it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. It doesn't matter if there are errors or not. And the beauty of it is that if you start early enough that you can leave it alone and then go back to it with a fresh eye and then make determinations about what areas that you want to pursue and which ones you don't. Then you can go to the writing phase. And in the writing phase, it doesn't have to be perfect. This is where you're beginning to put these ideas into sentences and paragraphs. But that ultimately, it's not perfect. This is the editing phase, the last phase, where you go through your sentences and you try to polish them so that they are as clear and concise as possible. I had a very wise professor in college once say that a paper is never done. You just have to hand it in at one point or another. And I think that's quite true, that we could spend a lifetime improving our writing. But the idea is that you want to do the best you can with the time limits that you've got. And just very briefly, and I hope this is review for you, if you are writing a paper, your introductory paragraph, your first paragraph, should have your thesis, which is what your main point is. It should be a sentence or two that basically summarizes what the paper is about. And you may not know what your paper is about initially. You might actually have to do some writing and then reread what you've written, summarize that in a sentence or two, and then plug it in after the fact in your introduction. I myself have done that with my own writing, because part of the writing exercise is discovering and learning, so that might indeed happen to you as well. Also in your introduction, this is where you give the author or the text. If you're talking about a particular film, this is where you would talk about the film and the director and the year. And your body paragraphs are where you include your evidence. This is where you've got quotation and paraphrase from a text. If you're working with a written text, if you're working with a film, this could be a place where you could put a timestamp if you wanted to use a direct quote. But you can also paraphrase it and put in your own words, so then you wouldn't necessarily have to put a timestamp. But if you are quoting, you're either doing a timestamp or you're doing something like putting a page number. And we do that with something called parenthetical documentation, which means that at the ending of the quote, whether your sentence is finished or not is irrelevant. Just at the ending of that particular quote that you selected, you place a parentheses, and within those parentheses, you give the least amount of information necessary in order for the reader to determine where that quote appeared. And then it's a complex system, because there are different ways to go about documenting if you are using, let's say, a website as opposed to using a book, as opposed to using a magazine article. But from a commonsensical perspective, the idea is that you just want to be able to supply the reader with enough information so that they can verify the authenticity of your quote. Usually we have something called a works cited page, which is at the ending of the paper, that would cite all of the works that you might have quoted from. And they're all listed by author last name in alphabetical order. Again, there are slight differences with how you would list a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to a magazine article. And the good news is that you don't really need to memorize any of this. You just basically look it up. The MLA, Modern Language Association, has basically a documentation guide, and you go through the guide almost like a cookbook, and you just basically follow all of the rules in terms of what it is that you need to do. And I have two websites that I can recommend to you that talk about documentation and also just talk about the writing process as well, that you might have heard of in previous English classes. One is Purdue OWL, and it was, or is basically, a site from Purdue University. What makes it so special is that it's accessible to the public, so you don't need to be a Purdue University's student. And it talks about the entire process of writing, from generating ideas to actually handing in a final draft, and how to go about quoting. And note that there are different systems for quoting based on different disciplines. So we are using the MLA, Modern Language Association, which is what we use for the humanities. and that would include our class. The sciences use a slightly different system, APA, American Psychological Association. The intent is the same, to be able to provide the audience with enough information so that the audience could verify the authenticity of a quote. But some of the rules, some of the details about where you put punctuation, for instance, and how you go about citing a source are different. So you want to make sure that you're following the right rules for the right discipline. And after you have your body paragraphs that give evidence and details, you've got a conclusion, and that's your last paragraph that gives a sense of closure. You're not adding any real new ideas, but you don't want to repeat what you said in your introduction. Certainly you don't want to repeat it verbatim. So, trying to find an interesting way to conclude, perhaps talk about a work from a related director, or perhaps talk about contemporary times and how that work might reference contemporary times. That's almost always effective with the conclusion. Keep in mind that a paragraph is 3 or more sentences, even though you might see paragraphs that are shorter in, let's say, journalism. But we're talking about academic writing, which is the same sort of writing that you would be expected to do in the workplace. So a paragraph has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end at bare bones minimum. It's probably a lot longer than that, than 3 sentences, but anything less than 3 sentences is not a paragraph. And a well-written paragraph, its first sentence, which is known as a topic sentence, summarizes what the paragraph is about. So in theory, if you've got a lot of well-written paragraphs, you should be able to read the first sentences of all of the paragraphs and get a kind of skeletal outline. This also works with your reading. So if you're reading, let's say, a textbook that's well written, you should be able to read the first sentences and get an outline to that particular chapter. That's in no way to suggest that you don't need to read the chapter in its entirety, but at least this might help you determine what main points are and supporting details. And in terms of essays, I know that oftentimes people talk about the 5-paragraph essay, the introduction, the conclusion, and then 3 body paragraphs. That would be the minimum for an essay. Anything less than 5 paragraphs technically isn't an essay. But once we're talking about advanced classes, then we're talking about that you want to really go beyond the 5-paragraph essay. So that would be at most minimum, but probably, or at least minimum. But I think that what you're going to find is that your typical 4 to 5 page paper is 6 paragraphs, 7 paragraphs, 8 paragraphs, depending upon the length of your paragraph. Each paragraph should deal with a specific topic. But if you're writing good opening sentences, then that opening sentence determines how broad or specific the topic of that paragraph is. So you have some ability to manipulate the focus of your paragraphs based on the opening sentence. You don't want a paragraph that's too long, obviously, because then it's too dense and too difficult to read. But again, you don't want it to be too short, and anything fewer than 3 sentences does not qualify as a paragraph. So a couple of random thoughts here, that a sentence expresses a complete thought. So as you're reading your paper, read those sentences as independent units and ask yourself, does this express a complete idea? And I suggest you read your paper and all of your writing out loud, because oftentimes you can hear errors within the writing. And a little trick, if you have trouble concentrating when you're proofreading, you might want to read backwards, starting from page 5, working your way to page 1, so that you can just focus on the actual sentences themselves. And thinking about what punctuation is, all it does is it helps to clarify meaning. A lot of times it tells us what we would normally do vocally. So, for instance, think about the distinction between saying sit down, or sit down, or sit down. And that's the difference between a period, or a question mark, or an exclamation point. But of course, when you're reading, you can't hear my vocal inflections, which is why you've got to add punctuation. Comma is usually just a pause, a place where we would normally take a breath when we're speaking, or a place where you want to emphasize something. And yes, there are rules, and I'm sure that you've talked about them in some of your English classes. And I don't want to belabor this because this is not an English class. But as I even tell my English students in English classes, that you want to train your ears so you can begin to hear errors. Almost like when you're listening to a piece of music. You may not be able to read music, but you can probably hear when the wrong note has been played. And the reality is that you don't need to explain what the error is. As long as you can fix it, unless you're going to be a musician, that's really all you need to do. And it's the same with your writing. So any other writing that you do, if something sounds wrong and you can identify that it sounds wrong, and you can fix it so that it's right, you really don't need to have to articulate what the error was, unless you're planning on being an English teacher or unless there's a particular reason why you would be motivated to do that. But again, I encourage you to look at sites like Purdue OWL because there are sections there on punctuation, and there are sections there on grammar as well. And don't forget the GCC library website. GCC is quite aware that you are going to be writing papers. And they have, as you can see, as I've listed the link in the notes below, in the second section of the notes, they have a section that's just devoted on the library website at GCC to writing and citation. So that's another place that you can look. But again, what I want you to do at this point is just to begin contemplating ideas. And you could certainly use things like some of the ideas you might have discussed or will be discussing in a journal. If I see something when I'm reading one of your journals that I think might be appropriate, I'll probably mention something. But just because I haven't mentioned it to you in a journal that it could be a final project topic, that doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't be appropriate. And something else that you might want to consider is thinking about our class discussion forum. And you might want to also think about how your responses, your classmates' responses, and my responses could perhaps be turned into a final project. Certainly the class readings that I've assigned and the class videos that I'm posting, all of those might give you ideas for final projects as well. And that said, it doesn't necessarily have to directly address one of the films that we are watching in class, but it should be focusing on the idea of what our topic is this semester, which is horror film in media and popular culture. So, in terms of our next discussion forum question, which would be due, your response that is, would be due by Saturday, the 7th of October, though certainly if you need additional time, please let me know. I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And the question is about Cat People. And after you viewed the film Cat People, what did you find to be the most surprising thing about Cat People and why? What did you find to be the most surprising thing about Cat People and why? Luckily, I was able to find the link for Cat People so that you can watch it for free online. It will become increasingly difficult to find free links online as the films become more contemporary. Certainly, I will offer links whenever I can. And certainly, if you find a better link than what I've been able to find because the audio or video quality is superior, or because closed captioning is offered and the version that I found didn't offer closed captioning, please share that with the class. Please send that to me. I've realized that oftentimes I've found links that are removed from the internet, probably because of copyright issues. So what might exist at one point in time may not necessarily exist in another point in time. But at least at this point in time, I can say that I was able to find a link for Cat People, which I have included below. So I hope you enjoy the film. As I said, I suspect that most, maybe all of you, have never seen it before. It's about an hour and 13 minutes. And as you know, most of the films have been in that time period. But as we get into more contemporary times, you'll see that the films will lengthen. And as you know, with the discussion forum, you're not required to respond to your peers, though I encourage you to, much like I encourage you in a face-to-face class. If we were meeting face-to-face to basically comment on your peers' comments in class, but you wouldn't be required to. But you are required to read your peers' comments and my comments in turn. So I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well. And in fact, actually, I just recently had my booster, and I can tell you that I was a bit tired and I was a bit achy, but it was well worth it. So I encourage you to get your boosters. Again, I'm doing well. I hope you're doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about cat people and our next film, which will be 1950s Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Take care. Bye-bye.